All right, there I am. Hello, good afternoon, West Coast. Good evening, East Coast. Props to anyone joining us late from Europe, and double props if you're on the other side of the Pacific this morning. And really, wherever you're tuning in from, welcome. We are thrilled that you're here. I'm Lane Nooney. I'm a computer and video game historian in the Media Studies Department at New York University. I'm also one of the co-founders and managing editor of ROMchip, a journal of game histories, the host of today's talk. So if you're new to ROMchip, welcome. ROMchip, URL romchip.org, is an open access journal devoted to game history. And so every year, right, scores of books, magazines, source code repositories, prototypes, fan archives, records, and life stories quietly disappear or become harder to access. At the same time, researchers around the world are uncovering incredible new stories that sometimes nobody can read because they're locked behind academic paywalls. ROMchip exists because we think both of those problems deserve the same solution. So we publish everything from peer-reviewed scholarship to oral histories, interviews, translations, and short essays on video games, board games, sports, and play. Everything we publish is completely ad-free, no paywalls, no advertisements, no subscriptions. Every issue is a range of academics, journalists, game designers, and archivists coming together in service of this mission. Our authors keep their copyrights, and we're trying to build a place where rigorous historical work is available to anyone who's interested. As we like to say, you shouldn't need a PhD to read or write for ROMchip. And a big part of that mission is bringing our scholarship out into the world. So what you're at right now, our ROMchip Presents Twitch Talks, aren't just promotional events. We think of them as part of how we think publishing should work. Over the past year, we've hosted 5 talks like this one. We've commissioned new work from freelance writers and translators, published original research from around the globe, and continued building a public archive of all these conversations on our YouTube. You'll find this posted early next week. And we've even got our latest issue technically coming out this month, but low-key, because you're here, for the secret 26 people in this room, it is soft-launched. If you go to romchip.org, you will see the new issue. We'll be dropping the newsletter announcement next week. We're still letting our authors go through the copy, but go ahead and go wild. We'll post a link in the chat. And, just to make sure you get that announcement, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an issue. Right there. Nope, didn't do it. Okay, we'll do it later. All right, so the only reason we're able to do any of this is because the community keeps showing up for us. Thank you, Logan, even when I fuck up in the chat. All right, so the point here is that ROMchip is entirely crowdfunded, in case you couldn't tell at this point. There is no other journal like this on Earth. Every article, every interview, every translation, every Twitch talk exists because people who care about game history decided that this project was worth supporting. Your donations help pay our copy editor, our web developer, freelance writers and translators, and even the 2 very hardworking individuals behind the scenes right now who make these talks so nice and smooth. Shout out to Cody and Conway. So if you enjoyed today's talk, or you simply believe that game history should be vibrant, independent, and have an open access home, I hope you'll consider supporting us. We'll drop a link in the chat for the best way that you can do that. But also, this just in, new announcement, we've got another way that you can support us, which is that the big brains at ROMchip have finally come up with some merch. You're seeing me wear some of it right now. ROMchip offers on our merch page is a chance for you to take a stand on whether you think video games is 1 word or 2 words, right? These hats come in the 2 different styles, as you see here. They've got our logo on the back. And so if the hat delights you as an object, you can pick one up or just feel free to donate. Every contribution, large or small, I'll put this cursed 1-word hat on for a moment here. It helps us keep doing more of exactly what we're doing right now. So with all of that out of the way, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Peter McDonald. So Peter McDonald, they, is a recently made associate professor of curriculum and instruction at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the School of Education, and they work on the history and interpretation of play. So Peter is the author of 2 monographs. First, Run and Jump, The Meaning of the 2D Platformer, released in 2024 from MIT Press, a book which hops across the history of the genre to explore the unique durability of the 2D platformer. And their second monograph, which is what they'll be presenting for us today in part, is titled The Impossible Reversal, a history of how we play, out this very year, 2026, from the University of Minnesota Press. The Impossible Reversal gives a history of play itself and the unique transformations it underwent in the post-war United States. I can't wait to hear more about that. We're so excited to share Peter's work with you. And now I will get out of your way and turn it over to our guest. We're thrilled to have you, Peter. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Lane. And I'm just going to start by echoing how amazing ROMchip is. Not only are they doing wonderful, exciting work around game history, not only are they an ethical and political organization that is doing work to support graduate students, scholars who are not at an institution, and the wider community, but they're doing something that's new. They're pioneering new ways of doing this kind of scholarship, and I think that it deserves our support. So, okay, let me dive in here. As Lane mentioned, my name's Peter McDonald. I teach in curriculum and instruction, which is a department that isn't necessarily the one you might most think of with game studies. And I'm a little bit of an odd fish in this department because I come from both a background in game production, and my sort of academic training is in English literature departments, which is where the more like interpretive side of my both my book projects comes from. So today I'm going to introduce you to a little bit of that interpretive side, and specifically I want to outline the big argument of the impossible reversal. I'm going to look at one methodological challenge that big argument opens up, and then explore some of the fascinating archival finds that I stumbled across as I was sort of trying to figure out how to answer that methodological challenge. Okay, so let's dive in. Play is kind of notoriously hard to define. Brian Sutton Smith, in the introductory section of The Ambiguity of Play, lists off just so many different things that we might mean when we talk about play. And some of those examples include daydreams, imagination, hobbies, listening to records, playing tricks, playing second fiddle, joking, travel, losing weight, playing music, being a play actor, birthdays, gambling, arm wrestling, sky jumping, and this is a much, much shortened version of the list that he gives. And in part, this is because play can take on a literally endless number of forms. As some play theorists argue, anything can become a game with just a small shift of perspective. And so one of the traditional ways that people have tried to wrestle with that expansiveness is, instead of saying play only occurs in these spaces or at these times, saying that play only has this subject matter or that theme, they turn to form, trying to define play through certain formal traits like its freedom, its boundary conditions, its uncertainty, its relationship to fun and pleasure. And in that way, play becomes a kind of singular and universal form that gets instantiated at different times and places, but stays kind of unchanged in itself. And this is the central thing that the impossible reversal takes issue with. It wants to argue, and I want to argue, that play is various, takes multiple shapes, and that play is fundamentally historical. And we might, at first glance, say that seems relatively straightforward. I think we all are somewhat used to historicizing major concepts in our everyday experience at this point. But it has some tricky features. So the first one is that often when we talk about game history, or the history of play rather, and I just made the same slip here, we talk about the history of games. And I want to tease those two things apart. Because, as I was just saying, the way that we define play as formal treats it as getting it's instantiated in each of these games, but itself not changing. And so if we want to be really historicist about it, we need to look not just at games and not just even at things like toys or puzzles. On the other hand, another way of thinking about play as various, as multifaceted, is to turn to the players and to think about the different play styles that people bring to their activity. So a classic example of that is Richard Bartle's typology of players in multi-user dungeons. And on the screen, you can see there's his classic diagram that charts players along two axes with 4 categories of killers, achievers, socializers, and explorers. Now, this kind of approach maps play onto pre-existing psychological profiles and preferences, which the player presumably derived from other non-play contexts and expresses there as well. So this tracks play and in its variety back to something that's not play, right? Back to someone who wants to socialize, they'll become a socializer. Someone who likes finding new things in their ordinary life, they'll become an explorer. So again, we don't get a variety in play itself. Play remains singular, abstract, and universal. And if we define it flexibly enough, it almost becomes a metaphysical attitude that can adapt to anything and everything. So this is sort of the key argument. How do we get past that framing of play as universal? Luckily, I'm not alone in thinking about play in this way. I have a lot of fellow scholars who are doing amazing work thinking about play from a perspective of cultural variation in anthropology, thinking about play as it is inflected by intersectional identities, such as Aaron Trammell's work or Kara Gaunt's The Games Black Girls Play. People who are thinking interestingly about the histories of play cultures. So I'm thinking here of Amy Ogata's Designing the Creative Child or Meredith Bach's Playful Visions. And perhaps one of the biggest inspirations for me is Mary Flanagan's Critical Play. I take a lot of cues from how she approaches play through the art practices that transform it and experiment with it and modify it. But I do think that within this approach to play, there are still some big methodological issues that haven't really been fully raised or addressed. And the impossible reversal is structured around 4 of those methodological questions. So first, if play is open to a kind of endless variety of shapes and contents, if it changes over time, how do we even recognize it without reducing it to a set of formal definitions? Second, if we're no longer restricting the history of play to its most obvious forms and its locations in games, toys, and sports, where then should we look for it? And in the impossible reversal, some of my answers include avant-garde art, leisure activities like swimming pools, flirting, academic theory, and much else. Third, once we've found a style of play that seems kind of original and new, how do we adequately describe it? How do we capture the features that make it up and deal with the subjective and affective judgments involved in capturing and sort of reflecting that experience? And fourth, let's assume we can accomplish all 3 of those earlier things, and we have some sense of a variety of different styles of play. How do we then understand their historical change? And this is the question I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to assume the previous 3 and just think a little bit about what I think is a fairly profound shift in the United States during the 1950s into a new model of play and playfulness that I call the era of designed play. So let me say a couple words about that phrase. The first is this concept of design. And one way to understand that, one that when I teach undergraduate game design courses as a sort of starting place, is that design encompasses really any act of making. When someone carves a doll out of wood for their children, it has some planning or intention behind it. They've made something, and we might say that that doll is designed. And in that sense, toys and games have always been designed. But I have something of a narrower meaning in mind here, which is that design is a kind of cultural practice that includes a shared set of techniques, things that mark out the products of design in a certain way, a public discourse about the values, goals, innovations, and limits of the practice, and one that evolves and changes over time. Design has a canon of examples that are held up as models for imitation, or things that we shouldn't do, or just curiosities that we should learn from. Design has a worldview that situates it as a practice within and against other modes of engaging with the world and other epistemologies. So design might share a lot with engineering, but the engineer and the designer come at a similar problem with slightly different mental models, tools, and discourses. And lastly, design involves a pedagogy that brings new practitioners into this community and allows them to do their own invention and shifting by building on a basic framework. So in that sense, when I say an era of designed play, I have a more structured notion of design that I want to focus on. Still, this might seem relatively banal, right? Like this is a lot of practices look like this, but it marks out a period of game making from a prior moment, which Douglas Guerra has talked about at length, and which I sort of summarize as a period where games are inventions. Game makers were credited as inventors on the boxes and papers of these games. They turned to the patent office as the place to secure their livelihoods financially and get recognition for their inventions. And while there might have been specialized practices and theories and discussions of how to make a game within an individual firm or by an individual designer, there wasn't a larger community discussion where it could become a shared endeavor that many people would iterate on and transform. And that model of thinking about game making as invention shapes how people play, shapes the kinds of games that get made, shapes how we discuss and theorize about games. So this is the first part of what I think is the shift in the 1950s. The second part is the word play. So when a design discourse did develop in the 1950s, I argue that it had a particular orientation towards play, and specifically that the experimentation and discussion of the designers was geared toward techniques that evoked different and distinct experiences of play. So rather than creating games that were precise, that functioned without problems, that were cheap, that were easy to learn, that were pleasing to the eye and ear, all things we could imagine people designing for, the real experimentation, I think, and I make the argument in the book, focused on a technical mastery of play experience. That goes a little bit further than what I'm going to be able to cover in the book. So for now and for the rest of this talk, I'm going to really focus on the design element of this era of design play. So that idea that this is a historical shift that starts in the 1950s took a while for me to formulate with this project. And this is a long project. I've been working on this as my dissertation work since the early 2010s, and it's taken many different forms and shifted over time. But when I started thinking about that historical change, it led me to ask, when did people actually start talking about game design? When was the first use of that as a term? And a quick Google Ngram search will show you a graph of it rapidly accelerating after the 1980s, but we see a first kind of bubbling up in the late 1950s. This is what led me to the archive I'm going to talk about today, is following this trail of when people started using the phrase game design. And the sort of site that we find it in, around the first sustained discussion, is a 1957 publication of a report on a management simulation game. So this is the first management simulation game. The game is called Top Management Decision Simulation, and it was published by the American Management Association. The game premiered in 1956 and was sort of test run then, but both the book and its main form that I'll talk about in a second were in 1957. And I'll show in the next few slides a number of images that come from this book, showing people playing the AMA game, or the American Management Association game. So this game was played by 5 teams of 3 to 5 people each, and they are positioned, these teams, at the head of a fictional company, taking on the role of CEO, chief financial officer, and chief technical officer, I think. I have to remember that. Each team, and these 3 people are that we see on screen, are sitting around a table playing the game. Each team begins with a quarterly operating budget. And based on that, they must make a number of decisions about how to allocate funds, set costs, develop research and new approaches, and expand their capital, their operating capital. Their decisions are then entered onto punch cards by an operator, and the results are tabulated at an IBM 650 mainframe computer, according to a hidden formula that you can read about in the AMA book, and based on the decisions of the other teams participating. So this diagram on screen is a rough map of how that flows, right? The key punch operator enters their results. The 650 calculates the overall state of the market. It prints out some results, and those are fed back to the teams. The results are returned to them along with some more general information about the state of their competitors and some speculative information that they can find if they do extra market research. In 1957, the game was commercialized as part of a 2-week-long retreat at Lake Saranac, New York, and executives paid the equivalent of $12,000 in 2026 dollars per person to participate, with some 400 people joining in. So it was a pretty lucrative venture, right? And I find it fascinating to think about this economic history of computer games well before the first arcades. This is a year before Tennis for Two, and it's being utilized by a much wider audience. The development team consisted of members of the executives at the American Management Association, as well as members of the military contractor Booz Allen Hamilton. This group toured RAND facilities during the process of making the game, and also took several cues from gaming initiatives being developed there, including mathematical game theory, resource allocation game models, and what were called crisis games, which are a fascinating thing in their own right. But there are some major differences between the goals of RAND in the military and the AMA game. Oh, sorry. This is someone charting out the results of their round of calculations. Okay. So the differences between the two sort of situations. The military simulations were primarily concerned with determining optimal outcomes. And to do this, they would closely and to the extent possible, scientifically approximate real-world scenarios and track step-by-step the consequences of either randomized trials or very heavily formalized decisions by the players. The AMA game, in contrast, is primarily designed as an educational tool. It's meant to give managers a chance to take on a slightly different role within their existing field, or try out a slightly different kind of company, in which they can explore the consequences of their actions, test their intuitions about market forces by condensing decades of time down to a few days of play. So what we see on screen here is the hall of managers, of the CEOs and lower middle management people being trained on how to play the AMA game. And then afterwards, they get a debriefing session. And this is what we see here. Somebody in what looks to me like a tuxedo and a bow tie, pointing out the choices that different teams have made and where some teams went right and where they went wrong. But in addition to the educational side, the AMA game also needed to take player enjoyment into account. While some of the military games might have been fun to play kind of incidentally, they were designed for a captive audience. In contrast, the management simulation games needed to first attract corporate executives who didn't have any necessary reason to come and play a game, and then hold the focus of those executives who probably had a lot of important things to do, at least in their own minds, for 2 weeks while they sat there waiting for other teams to make their decisions, waiting for the computer to calculate the results. And with a novelty game that couldn't really promise any guaranteed benefits. So the designers had long conversations as well about how to incorporate this element of fun and pleasure into the play. The AMA game was only the first in what really quickly became a burgeoning field of business simulations. In the next year, 5 new games were created. In 1959, that number rose to 25. And by 1960, there were over 100 such games in use. Some functioned as standalone workshops like the AMA game, but most happened in other places. So internal teams at companies like Pillsbury, General Electric, American Airlines, and Allstate developed trade secret games, like games that I haven't been able to find any trace of except for notation that they existed, but to model the internal workings of their companies and train executives on possible scenarios. Academic researchers at business programs, particularly at Carnegie Institute of Technology, developed games for their students to play. Some of these ran across the entire semester and had hundreds of students participating and competing for their company to do the best. And Avalon Hill, better known as a publisher of war games, even published a commercial version of a board game like this called Management. And on screen you can see the board of management laid out with several chits and quarter by quarter changes in the market state in the center. This is a very boring game to play, is my experience, but it is still in the realm of enticing and exciting of war games that Avalon Hill is known for. So we see like this model is not just a one-off, but filters out into a wide range of influential places. So this proliferation is striking in itself, but what I really want to pay attention to is the design discourse that percolates around all of these games. And already in 1957, the Top Management Decision Simulation book leads the way. So first, it has a long discussion of how the designers built the game, what their decision-making process was, how they envisioned it. They discuss why they made a quantitative game rather than a qualitative one, why they avoided human relations issues, why they made it complicated enough to approximate real business decisions, but didn't want to make a huge rule book, why they focused on the top level of management decision-making, because they thought it provided a synoptic view of the whole process and typified what any manager would have to think about. How they formulated 20 key decision moments that abstracted and represented the basics of business decision-making. why they provide better than real information to their players to help them understand the system, and how they called different strategies that they thought were too extreme from the process. So first, right, they give a long description, what it means to make a game. But that leads even further into what are basically philosophical discussions about the problems of designing a game. So in this new section, it's another 15 pages, they talk about questions that don't have a solution, only heuristics to guide potential other simulation designers. So there are questions like, who wins and why? The designers think that there's a direct comparison is impossible between different players and different teams. And so rather we have to construct a philosophical idea of what winning means and why it matters. They ask, how should decisions be evaluated? The players' decisions. Should they be tracked to the results of, say, an empirical study? Should we go out and study how the steel business works and use that to grade players? Or should they be judged based on what the most common sense opinion of business looks like? Or should we try and translate specific academic theories into game terms? They ask, how detailed and realistic should a model be? Right? How much detail is too much to be understood? How does introducing chance make the players feel like their decisions don't matter, even if it makes the game more realistic? This is again a major distinction from some of the military games. They ask, where should the player's effort be directed? Should it be to decisions that have a big strategic impact? Should it be to gathering information about the game state? Should players be the ones having to do the calculation that the computer is doing? So these are some of big questions that to some extent feel very contemporary. Reading through these designers talking about their way of making a game, I'm deeply struck by how little has changed in the game design discourse. And lastly, the third thing that strikes me about reading these is the clear articulation of a pedagogical aim. And this is, I think, a major shift from other ways we might understand simulation games as having a longer history. So, one way of thinking about that is, say, chess simulates war, and that people have perhaps learned lessons about military strategy for as long as chess has existed. Same with more formalized war games. Right? But even in the war games, there isn't a sort of separate discussion of how to use them pedagogically, or a clear philosophy of what learning is and how to achieve it. With the top management decision simulation, we suddenly get a full-blown philosophy of what games can do. So I'm going to read a quote here from one piece of the book, where they describe what they call the crux of the process. The major objective of the program is to provide realistic situations in which the learner can increase his capacity as a business decision maker through increasing his understanding of the design process and sharpening his analytic skills. Data collection, evaluation and analysis, situation diagnosis, solution, alternative development. To this end, he progresses through a series of gameplay situations which increase in difficulty. Tightly integrated with the actual play are pre-play briefing sessions, which set the stage and accustom the player to the simulation illusion, as well as post-play result analysis and group critique meetings in which attention is called to details of the action. In accordance with the shifting focus, through questioning by staff discussion leaders and the feeding back of observation data on critical events. It is in these critiques that the all-important reflection and discussion takes place. So we see here game design being situated as one particular framework that has strengths and weaknesses for solving a pedagogical problem. It starts to take on the shape of a specific epistemology that can be located within and against other practices. So this book in itself is a fascinating archival piece, but it quickly, just like the games, becomes just one piece in a wide-ranging discussion of game design. There are a dozen more books, several symposia, and organizations in the late 1950s and early 1960s dedicated to just these kinds of management games. They slowly extend into other fields. So one of the earliest examples of a different topic is international relations. Northwestern University builds an international relation simulation in 1958. And they get taken up as a kind of prehistory to some of the stories that we maybe know a little bit better. So some of the people who go on to found the journal Simulation and Gaming start in this management gaming world. Clark Apt, who writes one of the first books on serious games, takes a lot of cues from this management gaming world. Buckminster Fuller is, when he's building his world game project, thinking about and related to some of these managerial games. So my point is that design becomes a kind of new framework that presupposes some fundamental shifts in the production, reception, and theorization of play. Instead of a childish and irrational remainder that play kind of was in the 19th century, it becomes a subject for technological mastery. And the consequences of that change are really what the rest of the Impossible Reversal tries to track. Just as a Easter egg, one of my favorite little pieces is this diagram from another book of the period where they list out the steps in game design. And I won't go through them all, but one of the strange kind of mirror world features of looking at this design discourse is that rather than calling it play testing, everyone in this period calls it test playing. And I don't know what to do with that, but I find it wonderful. So returning to the categories I outlined earlier, I think we can, again, see now that there is a shared set of practices and techniques. There is a public discourse that talks about these values, goals, and innovations. That there is a growing canon here with the AMA game serving as its first exemplar of examples of what to build. There's a worldview that situates game playing as one educational technique against other things like role-playing or lectures. And that there's a clear pedagogy of training people as game designers. So that's sort of where I'm going to leave you. I hope this is a teaser for some of the bigger arguments that build out from this, and that maybe I've introduced you to one or two new, push back your boundary of where game studies might look for some interesting examples just a little bit. Thank you.
All right, are we? Let me know when we're up. Okay. Okay, I'm still just gathering questions. Folks, if you have questions for Peter, please just put them in the chat, and I will scour them and surface them for this conversation. There is just one factual question. McMahon asks, what is the name of the book/paper that the AMA game designers put out? I think they just want that repeated.
Yeah. It's the same as the title of the... Oh, I'm getting an echo. Oh.
It's me?
Okay, I'm going to try again. It's just the same as the title of the game. It's Top Management Decision Simulation. And you can find a copy of it on HathiTrust, so it's pretty easy to browse.
Okay, cool. We're going to start then with a question from, let's see here, sorry. I think kind of, so Jose had a couple kind of like questions/comments. Oh God, it's a whole chain of you all, Jesus. where Jose says, this is all the fault of von Neumann and Morgenstern in what feels like the creation / invention of game theory that then influences all this other stuff to be used in professional contexts. Schuslad then, says they also want to hear Peter talk more about how this intersects with game theory in the 1950s. Can you kind of stitch that whole world that doesn't quite surface in this talk, like into this conversation?
Yeah. So I see the influence, the sort of direct influence on the managerial folks coming through a number of these initiatives at RAND and at the Air Force and Army defense stations that they toured. So mathematical game theory is absolutely one of those strands. But one of the things that I sort of like wrestled with as I dug into this archive is just how many separate strands of game-based practices were actually simultaneously happening at RAND, and how they get a little bit confused in some of the literature. So there's the mathematical game theory. Then there's a whole set of simulation programs that are logistics simulations. So Air Battle Model is one of the earliest for a computer version. But then there's also a manual game, one that you play on pen and paper, called Monopologues, that is just Monopoly plus logistics, where they put a human in the supply chain to see what sort of decisions they'll make about best practices for sorting warehousing materials. There is what I was mentioned, crisis gaming, which is sort of like a role play situation where people at RAND are basically letting different people take on countries and setting up a hypothetical scenario and trying to game out what each country would do to advance their best interests. And then there's a thing called NEWS, and I'm blanking on what the acronym stands for, naval something. But it's the big, like, multi-story complex that the scene in War Games is based on, where there's like a map of the globe and submarine commanders are taking orders in a kind of simulated war situation. So all of these these things that are taking some inspiration from games are active at the same time. And to me, that's like the interesting thing is there's a larger epistemological shift that is making games the thing people are turning to.
To speak to that, Sledeknuf, I don't know how to pronounce that username, my apologies, has a question kind of about that shift, right? What are the kind of macro historical changes, cultural, technological, economic, that account for the transition to what you've identified as this new approach to play in the 1950s?
I think
do you have a grand theory of history? You know?
I don't have a grand theory, but I have a lot of little theories. I don't know if they all add up to an explanation, but so one piece is one that I've already sort of talked about, but from a different angle. Design was becoming a technological project in its own right? So the strand of thinking coming out of the Bauhaus and moving into Buckminster Fuller's like universal design science, I think has a big role to play in any explanation. The design, for whatever reason, becomes a mode of technical mastery. Another big piece of this is what's happening with leisure time. So we have sort of what are being identified in the 1940s and 50s as various crises around leisure. Some of this is the reduction of working hours. People are writing apocalyptic pieces about how they won't have anything to do once they get down to 2 hours of working a day, or pieces about like their fears about retirement. These are sort of like new anxieties that are appearing in this moment. Some of which is coming from the moments where leisure is like enforced, right? So the Great Depression or World War II are both moments where there's long stretches of time where nothing is happening. and boredom reigns. There's also like all of the stuff around like new credit and consumer culture in the late 1950s that makes some people, some economists, start to identify play and leisure as the one area of the economy that can always grow. Right? So they see play and leisure as a solution to the problems of the Great Depression. And then there's like a piece of it which is deeply related to race. I don't know entirely how it like clicks in here, but things like the investment in the public park system and the white flight of leisure activities out of the inner city into ski resorts and public parks, and like this movement of where capital around, where the sort of production of leisure happens. So all of these are like pieces of the story, but I don't kind of build a grand unified theory out of them in the book.
Okay. All right. That's for book 2, I assume. It's what's coming. So we got a question from Logan. Logan Brown Games says, picking up some of the parallels Jose has been noting, how do you think about relationships between something like these management games and commoditized board games like Risk that are being, quote, designed at the time? Are they united by some sort of shared episteme? Is that episteme design, gamification, or something else?
It's a great question. It's in some way like the question that I sort of bracketed when I said that I wasn't going to talk about play, because the goal of this book is to really delve into 4 styles of play and playfulness that I think characterize this moment from the 1950s. And it's a little bit too big of a thing to bite off right now, but I'll give you the tiny nibble of it, which is I think what unites these games and leads up to things like SimCity is a particular playfulness in the act of simulating. So I talk a little bit about a change in toy ovens in the introduction. So 19th century toy ovens are cast iron. You actually light them, like you put wood inside of them and you light them up, and they burn down many people's houses.
Great for kids. You know?
Yeah, exactly. So the Easy Bake Oven comes along, and traditionally it's understood as a safer version of a 19th century toy oven. But it comes along with a lot of other shifts in how the activity of cooking relates to children. And so in the original toy ovens, you use real utensils. Like, they don't come with pre-made batters and tiny spoons and bowls. You got to like actually get out the flour and butter and mix them up yourself, which is a thing generally kids are pretty good at and have fun with. Whereas the Easy Bake Oven turns that all into like a dull world of making food. And so there's a shift in what even simulation, what our relationship to the sort of mimesis of games looks like here, I think. Where the pleasure of trying to like find the inconsistencies, to feel out like where this doesn't fit in the world, becomes a major sort of source of joy. And this is where like some of the ways that the designers talk about the debrief sessions really brings out how people like love finding the things that aren't true about the simulations and hypothesizing about what would happen if it was more like the industry they're from. So this is just a sort of taste of the aesthetic side of the project, of where I'm trying to like outline what the change in the very subtle change in that feeling leads to.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to throw you 2 separate questions right now, only because you kicked off a lot of questions, which is great news, you know? So first, Jose wants another whack at it. Professor Segal says, slight pushback question, : why not start designed play with the earlier work that theorists and educators were doing in the context of reimagining early childhood education? So He's thinking about Froebel's gifts, Maria Montessori's work. Does that kind of context show up in your book, or have you know, what are your thoughts about how that kind of relates to this, to what you're sketching here?
Yeah. So it does show up in some ways. My partner is a 19th century person, and so we've talked a lot about various forms of play and especially the Victorian moment. And my view is that while there is a intentional creation of, say, of Froebel's gifts, the goal isn't to design specific play experiences. Like, Froebel believes these are universal forms, like people should, they're platonic objects, right? They're the things that every human needs to know and engage with, not specific aesthetic ways of engaging. They become, I think, more like a designed object as we move into the 20th century, right? With like Montessori, I think, is much closer to the sort of model that I'm thinking about. But even then, the designed aspect doesn't get a lot of a public discourse around. So the example I talk about is the playground movement, where there is absolutely a focus on the joy of experiences. If you look at the advertisements that show up in like the trade journal Recreation for teeter-totters and slides and a lot of like playground equipment that seems incredibly dangerous and that we don't have anymore, there's a focus on these like thrills or what teetering feels like. But those are never sort of organized into a design discourse about how we can accomplish those. They're left as a kind of like fantasy that foreshadows, I think, this moment, but it builds towards it.
Got it. Thank you. And then I said I was going to ask you two questions, and then I forgot. The second question was from Steph Bullock. Have you looked at the historical emergence of the term game development / developer? And does that intersect with this idea of game designer?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that to some extent, is like where my next project might be going. It's a little early to say, but I've become really interested in the history of how game design got institutionalized at universities. And that, I don't have like a good answer for Steph yet, but that's sort of a thing that I'm starting to think about and always happy to talk about more.
Cool. One quick factual question. Robot Crusoe wants to know, is there a good place to learn more about the AMA game, i.e. the manuals and documentation?
Yeah, so the book that the AMA puts out, called Top Management Decision Simulation, is pretty amazing in terms of like what it contains. It has, in addition to the design elements that I talked about, it has a fairly clear breakdown of how the play actually works. It has documentation of the forms that people used while they were playing the game. It has not the actual punch card code, but a clear enough description of the internal formulas that it wouldn't, I think, be impossible to recreate the game entirely. So there's some other secondary material, and if anyone is interested in getting deeper into this, I'm happy to share my own bibliography. But that book is a good place to start.
And is the book publicly available?
Yeah, you can find it on HathiTrust, no problem.
Okay. And then I had a question. I got two final questions. So I want you to do a little like speculative historicization. So when I was when I was listening to your talk, I actually went up and like looked at my opening lecture for my video game economies class, which is about the pre-commercial origins of game development as it comes out of the military industrial complex, right? It's a pretty like well-trod origin point for doing the history of games. I do a little bit on like, yeah, we used computers to play tic-tac-toe. Here's the cover of Hoochspiel, right? Before getting into Tennis for Two, right? Which is kind of historically called the grandfather of video games, right? And you mentioned kind of, I think, just as a novelty, this is a game that emerges a year before Tennis for Two and actually has this explicitly commercial kind of trajectory that's coming maybe not quite out of the military industrial complex in the same way, but also not, I think, right? And I was wondering if you could kind of play out the stakes of a history in which like Top Management Simulator is the grandfather of video games, right? Like what does that do? What might that do for the way we would rethink video game history if that is your patrilineal kind of, you know, quote unquote seminal origin point?
Great question. I have a couple thoughts. They're maybe a little bit silly, but
yeah, no, go for it. That's all I want.
So one is, I think it gets at your hat, right? Like this is not a video game. There's no video in this. It is a punch card game, and so that
it is a computer game in like the deepest sense, right?
Yeah, there's just like computing.
Any good historian would also tell you Tennis for Two is not a video game.
Yes, right. But, you got a cathode ray screen. Right. I think that's actually really important. And so there's the computing side of it, which is really important. But we might even, and I kind of make this argument in the book, like there's something about electricity that shifts the boundaries where we might draw a digital binary distinction. So there's all of these like arcade amusements, these electromechanical games that you couldn't really say are doing any computing, but are electrified. And by thinking about electrification as and if David's still in the chat, I'm sure this is...
Yeah, I was like, Dave Parisi in the chat, we summon you, right?
Yeah.
Like...
I think that just like changes a lot of the discourse around the binary analog structure that shapes so much of how we still think about games today. So
okay. I want a much longer in this essay. I will about that. Yeah. All right. My absolute last question before I let you go is, and this is a new game we're going to play for all new speakers, but you get to choose as a thank you for giving this talk. You get the ROMchip hat of your choice in the style of your choice. So first of all, you need to tell us all, is it one word or two? And then do you like a dad hat or a snapback?
Oh, man. Now that I've all said this, I'm going to go with the cursed one word.
Oh, amazing. All right. One word.
The snapback.
Okay. All right. Perfect. It will be, we will get your mailing info at a later date and get that off to you as a thank you for contributing to ROMchip. With that, yeah, and we make you do that on the record, actually. That will be part of the recording. Fantastic. All right, for the archive. Everybody, thank you for coming. So hold on, I'm wrapping it up. So if you love today's talk and you believe in what ROMchip's doing, first thing you can do is subscribe to our newsletter. You'll never miss a talk, never miss an issue. We're not super spammy. We really only contact you when we have events happening. And we do, we're not gonna fill up your inbox, I promise. If you love the stupid hats, you can get some merch from our fourth wall shop. If you would like to just give us some good old-fashioned money, you can always donate to us via our fiscal sponsor, Hat Club. And for those of you who like to get your calendars out way in advance, our next ROMchip Presents talk will be Tuesday, October 6th, same time, 7 p.m. We're going to have Julia Milland on to talk about the history of Tetris. So mark your calendars. And otherwise, Peter, thank you so much. And I'll see all of you soon.
Thank you, Lane, and thank you, everyone, for coming out.